Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here this evening as we work through this evening's class. I'll actually be on an airplane, and Ashley will be um, overseeing the class and playing this pre-recorded lecture for tonight. My goal is to get through the basics of the information for the lecture part, and at the end of the class, as time permits, you'll have the opportunity to continue working on any assignments and quizzes that are currently open for you to work through. Chapter 21 is going to cover antitrust laws and promoting competition. So we will be looking at the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, and the enforcements and exceptions or exemptions, and we'll also be looking at U.S. antitrust laws when it comes to a global context. On the screen, you'll see that the learning objectives include understanding what is a monopoly, what is a market power, and how these concepts relate to each other. We'll also look at what the courts do in order to rule when it comes to situations such as price fixing, and we'll also look at what's prohibited by Section 2 of the Sherman Act, and then also the four major provisions of the Clayton Act and what activities these provisions do prohibit. And we'll also look at the federal agencies or government entities that can enforce the federal antitrust laws, and we'll also look at how the U.S. court will apply the Sherman Act to any foreign person or entities as it relates to them. Today's antitrust laws are the direct descendant of common law actions intended to limit restraints on trade. These actions are dated all the way back to the 15th century in England. After the U.S. Civil War of 1861 to 1865, the American public became increasingly concentrated and concerned about the declining competition in the marketplace. Large corporate enterprises were attempting to reduce or to eliminate any competition by legally tying themselves together in contracts that would create business trust. And these are unincorporated organizations with limited liability. The most powerful of these organizations at the time was the Standard Oil Trust. In 1890, Congress passed the Act to Protect Trade and Commerce against Unlawful Restraints and Monopolies. Basically, this is commonly known as the Sherman Antitrust Act, or commonly known as the Sherman Act. The Sherman Act became and is still one of today's most powerful weapons in an effort to maintain the competitive economy that we are aware of today. And the act and the role of the Standard Oil Trust in its passage um, can be examined in full if you want to look at the landmark in the law feature of your text in either the printed or the ebook format. But as an overall review, the author of the Sherman Act, which was Senator John Sherman, who happened to be the brother of a famous Civil War general, William Sherman, recognized the financial authority, and he was concerned for years about the diminishing competition within the U.S. industry and the emergency of monopolies as was exhibited by the Standard Oil Trust. In 1890, or by 1890, the Standard Oil Trust had become one of the foremost petroleum refining and marketing combinations in the United States. Streamlined, integrated, centrally controlled, Standard Oil maintained an indisputable monopoly over the industry and thus controlled 90% of the U.S. market for refined petroleum products, making it impossible for small producers to compete with them. And the increasing consolidation in the U.S. industry, and particularly Standard Oil Trust, it came to the attention of the public in 1881. At that time, Henry DeMaurice Lloyd, who was a young journalist from Chicago, published an article in the Atlantic Monthly that was entitled "The Story of a Great Monopoly." The article argued that the U.S. petroleum industry was dominated by one firm, Standard Oil, and Lloyd's article was so popular that its issue was reprinted 6 different times. It marked the very beginning of the U.S.'s public growing concern over monopolies. And with that, some of the major provisions that came out of the Sherman Act, as we see here on the screen, every contract, combination in the form of a trust or otherwise, or in conspiracy, in restraint of trade or commerce among several states or with foreign nations is hereby declared to be illegal and therefore is a felony that can be punishable by fine and or imprisonment. And 2, every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize or combine or conspire with any other person or persons to monopolize any part of trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations shall be deemed guilty of a felony and is similarly punished as if it was in the first item here. And this is where, just as a side note, that when you have local gas stations, they cannot contact each other and conspire with each other to set a gas price within a market that they operate. When we look at the differences between Section 1 and Section 2, the 2 sections of the Sherman Act are quite different. Violations of Section 1 requires 2 or more persons, as a person cannot contract or combine or conspire alone. Thus, the essence of the illegal activity is the act of joining together. Section 2, though, can apply either to one person or 2 or more persons because it refers to every person. Thus, unilateral conduct can also result in a violation of the Sherman Act, Section 2. It follows that the cases brought under Section 1 of the Sherman Act differ from those brought under Section 2. Section 1 cases are often concerned with the finding of an agreement that is written or oral that will lead to some type of restraint or trade. And Section 2 cases deal with the structure of a monopoly that already exists within the marketplace. The term monopoly generally is used to describe a market which there is a single seller or a very limited number of sellers, whereas in Section 1, focusing on the agreements that are restrictive, that is, the agreements have a wrongful person, and as I mentioned in the prior slide, This is where your local gas stations, if they were to conspire with each other to set the market price of a community, then that would be illegal. Uh, Monopoly powers exist where a firm has an extreme amount of market power such that it will affect the price of the market. So when we look at both sections 1 and 2, they both seek to curtail market practices that result in an undesired monopolistic pricing and output behavior. And for a case to be brought under Section 2, the threshold or necessary amount of monopoly power must already exist. And we'll see that when you review the slide that is coming up next, where we'll see the requirements. So as you can see from this slide, the violation requirements for Section 1 and Section 2 are listed on the screen. The Sherman Act applies only to restraints that have a substantial impact on interstate commerce. Generally, any activity that substantially affects interstate commerce falls within the scope of the Sherman Act. The Sherman Act also extends to the U.S. nationals abroad who are engaged in activities that have an effect on U.S. foreign commerce. Federal courts have exclusive jurisdiction over antitrust cases brought under the Sherman Act. State laws regulate local restraints on competition, and state courts can decide claims that are brought under those laws. The underlying assumption of Section 1 of the Sherman Act is that society's welfare is harmed if rival firms are permitted to join in an agreement that consolidates their market power or otherwise restrains competition within the market. The types of trade restraints that Section 1 of the Sherman Act prohibits generally fall within two broad categories, which are horizontal restraints and vertical restraints, both of which will be explained shortly as we move through this chapter. But first, though, we're going to look at the rules that courts may apply when assessing the anti-competitive impact of alleged restraints on trade. The first one that we'll look at is the per se violations versus the rule of reason. Some restraints are so blatantly and substantially anti-competitive that they are deemed per se violations. And this basically means that they are illegal per se or on their face value or inherently under Section 1. Other agreements, however, even though they result in enhanced market power, do not unreasonably restrain trade. So using what is called the rule of reasons, the court will analyze the anti-competitive agreements that allegedly violate Section 1 of the Sherman Act to determine whether they actually constitute reasonable restraint on trade. The need for the rule of reason analysis of some agreements in restraint of trade is obvious. If the rule of reason had not been developed, almost any business agreement could conceivably be held as violating the Sherman Act. So therefore, Justice Louis Brandeis effectively phrased this statement in the Chicago Board of Trade versus the United States in 1918. He stated that Every agreement concerning trade, every regulation of trade restrains. To bind, to restrain, is their very essence. So the true test of legally is whether the restraint imposed is such as merely regulates and perhaps thereby promotes competition, or whether it is such as it may suppress or even destroy competition. So factors that a court may consider under the rule of reason are going to include uh, items that are seen here on the screen, such as the purpose of the agreement, the ability to implement the agreement, the effect or potential effect of that agreement, and whether or not the parties could have relied on less restrictive means to achieve their purpose. For example, there was a group of consumers that sued NBC Universal, the Walt Disney Company, and other broadcasters, as well as cable and satellite distributors for antitrust violations. The consumers claimed that the bundling together of high demand and low demand television channels in cable and satellite programming packages violated the Sherman Act. Building forces, or the bundling forced consumers to pay for channels they did not want to watch and um, did not want the access to those channels on a regular basis. So the consumers argued that the defendants, through their control of high demand programming, exercised market power that made it impossible for any distributor to offer unbundled programming. And a federal appellate court ruled in favor of the defendants and dismissed the case. The court reasoned that the bundling of channels does not injure competition and does not violate the Sherman Act. And of course, today we do see where all of the different streaming services that do exist out there, you do have the option today to work with either a cable company for their entire programming package, satellite companies for their entire packages, or you can use an internet service and pick and choose which streaming services you may want to view as a part of your viewing habits. When we talk about horizontal restraints, that's basically encountered frequently in the antitrust laws. Horizontal restraint basically refers to any agreement that in some way restrains competition between rival firms competing in the same market. Horizontal restraints may include price fixing, group boycotts, market divisions, and also trade associations. When we look at price fixing, uh, any price fixing agreement, which is an agreement among competitors to fix prices, is a violation of Section 1. And as mentioned in one of the prior slides about pricing of gas in a market falls under this when you start calling your competitors and setting your prices based on their pricing, or you have a conversation about setting a price that is above the market to move the market and those kind of things. So um, now these type of agreements, when it comes to price fixing, They may not be explicit, but as long as the result of such conversations restricts the output or artificially fixes any pricing, it will violate the very law. Now, when it comes to group boycotts, this generally is going to be an agreement between two or more sellers to refuse to deal with any particular person or firm because they involve a concerted action. Therefore, group boycotts have been held to constitute a per se violation of the Sherman Act. And to prove a violation of Section 1, the plaintiff must demonstrate that the boycott or the joint refusal to deal with um, an individual or firm was undertaken with the intention of eliminating competition or preventing entry into any given market. Most boycotts are illegal. A few types of boycotts, such as a group boycott against a supplier for political reasons, may be protected under the First Amendment rights of expression. Um, but again, that is different than two businesses coming together to boycott another firm or the entry of another uh, competition source into a market. When we look at market divisions, it basically is a per se violation of Section 1 of the Sherman Act for competitors to divide up territories or customers when they are having that type of a conversation. It's illegal for three separate manufacturers of smart TVs, as as an example, to agree to divide up their sales into three separate geographical areas. Could you imagine if in Alaska we could only buy a Samsung TV and not have the option for an LG TV, a Vizio, or any of the other brands that are in the market? When we look at trade associations, businesses that are in the same general industry or profession will frequently organize into trade associations to pursue common interests. Any trade association may engage in various joint activities such as exchanging information, representing the members' business interest before any governmental body. They may conduct advertising campaigns, setting regulatory standards to govern the industry or profession. Generally, the rule is applied to many of these horizontal actions, and if a court finds that the trade association practices uh, or has any agreements that restrain trade, then that is sufficiently beneficial both to the association or the public. It may be deemed the restraint could be reasonable. Now, if we have a concentrated industry, however, then the trade association can be, and they have been used to facilitate anti-competitive actions such as price fixing and allocating markets. And that's where it comes into the concept of a concentrated market, which is where one, there is either a single firm or a small number of firms that are going to control a very large percent of a market with their sales that are involved. So when trade association agreements have substantially anti-competitive effects, then a court is going to consider them to be in violation of Section 1 of the Sherman Act. Vertical restraints of trade result from an agreement between firms at different levels in the manufacturing and the distribution process. So in contrast to the horizontal relationship, which occurs at the same level, vertical relationships encompass the entire chain of production. The chain of production normally encompasses the entire chain of production. It normally includes the purchase and the inventory. It includes the basic manufacturing and also the distribution to wholesalers, and ultimately has an impact on the eventual sale of the product at the retail level. So when a single firm carries out two or more of these separate functions, then it is considered to be a vertically integrated firm. And even when firms operating at different functional levels may not be in direct competition with one another, but they are in competition with other firms. So any agreement between firms that stand in that vertical relationship could affect competition. When we look at the territorial or customer restrictions, this basically involves arranging for the distribution of products uh, where a manufacturing firm is often going to insulate dealers from the direct competition with other dealers selling the same or similar product. And to do so, it may institute territorial restrictions or attempt to prohibit other wholesalers or retailers from reselling the same product uh, to buyers and other competing resellers in a market. Now, there could be situations where there may be a legitimate purpose, and sometimes that legitimate purpose may include, as we've talked about in previous chapters, say a franchise agreement where in Anchorage, for example, the McDonald's here are owned by the same franchise group for the locations that are here in town. So that would be slightly different, but McDonald's are not competing with each other. They are competing with your other restaurants such as Burger King, Dairy Queen, and other fast food restaurants. There are times when we look at resale price maintenance agreements, and these are agreements between a manufacturer and a distributor or a retailer in which the manufacturer specifies what the retail price of its product must be, and that's generally going to be referred to as a resale price maintenance agreement. Such agreements were also once considered to be per se violation of the Sherman Act, but today, however, both maximum resale price maintenance agreements and minimum resale price agreements are judged under the rule of reason. The setting of a maximum or a minimum price that retailers and distributors can charge for a manufacturer's product may sometimes increase competition and benefit the consumers. So if we think about it in this way, most auto dealerships are going to have a sticker price, and that is generally what the manufacturer or the uh, distribution center is saying that based on the cost to build that vehicle, this is what you should sell it for. Now, as we know, that sticker price on a vehicle generally is a quote suggested retail price, and a lot of times dealerships will take a position and policy stand that the sticker price is the price we sell the vehicle for, and we negotiate on other items such as your trade-in vehicle, um, any rebate monies, loyalty monies, and other things to adjust that price one way or the other. The other thing that dealerships could do when it comes to vehicles is if someone walks in and is going to write a check or pay cash for a vehicle, then there could be some flexibility in the pricing, but often you'll see suggested retail pricing on vehicles, and then with other items you'll see suggested retail pricing, and the suggested retail pricing may be what you pay in a department store if you walk in and buy it. And then when you look at the same item, say on Amazon.com, it could be much lower, and often those pricing points are set based on the cost of an item and the desire to entice people to purchase things online versus at the local retail. So Section 2 of the Sherman Act um, is somewhat different. Section 1 of the Sherman Act prohibits certain concentrated activities that restrict trade. In contrast, when we look at Section 2, Section 2 condemns every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize. So thus, the two distinctive behaviors are subject to sanctions under Section 2 involving the monopolization and the attempt to monopolize a market. And often we can see this in one tactic that is known as predatory pricing. Predatory pricing involves an attempt by one firm to drive its competitors from the market by selling the product at prices substantially below the normal cost of production. And once the competitors are eliminated, then the firm will presumptively or presumably attempt to recapture any of its losses by going much higher than what the original retail price would have been. Thus, they're driving prices up far beyond what the competition would have been had everybody still been competing with each other. So the U.S. court has defined the offense of monopolization as having two distinct elements. The first is the possession of monopoly power in the relevant market, and the second is the willful acquisition or maintenance of power as distinguished from growth or development as a consequence of a superior product, business acumen, or historic accident. To establish a violation under Section 2, a plaintiff must prove both of these elements exist, the monopoly power and the attempt to monopolize. And when we think about the Sherman Act, it really does not define monopoly, but in economic theory, monopoly refers to the control of a single market by a single entity, and it's been well established in antitrust law that a firm may be deemed a monopolistic firm even though it's not the sole seller in the market. So that does happen. When it comes to proving monopoly power, uh, there has to be direct evidence that the firm has used its power to control the pricing and to restrict the output. And usually there is not enough evidence to show that the firm was intentionally controlling prices. So often the plaintiff has to offer indirect or circumstantial evidence that a monopoly power exists. So to prove that the monopoly power is indirectly exists, in existence, the plaintiff must show that the firm has a dominant share of the relative or relevant market, and there are significant barriers to any other new competitors entering into a market um, where they exist. And when we talk about the relevant market, before a court can determine whether a firm has a dominant market share, we have to look at, and the court has to define what is a relevant market. And for a relevant market to exist, there has to be two elements. There has to be a relative or a relevant product market and a relevant geographic market. And the relevant product market does include all products that, although they may be produced by different firms, but they have identical attributes. For example, tea. Um, when we think about tea, there are multiple brands of tea, and there are different types of tea within the different brands. So when we look at the reasonable interchangeableness of products, that is also looked at as to whether or not consumers can treat them as an acceptable substitute. So, for example, coffee may be substituted for tea if someone doesn't want to buy tea within a local market. When we look at the intent requirement for the Sherman Act, Section 2, monopoly power in and of itself does not constitute the offensive or the offense of monopolization under Section 2. The offense also requires the intent to monopolize. So for a dominant market share, it must result in a business acumen or the development of a superior product. It may simply be the result of a historic accident. In these situations, the acquisition of a monopoly power may not violate any antitrust law. It would be contrary to society's interest to condemn every firm that acquired a position of power because it was well managed and efficient and marketed a product that was desired by the consumers. But in contrast, if a firm does possess market power as a result of carrying out some purposeful act to acquire and maintain power through anti-competitive means, then it does fall under the Section 2 as a violation. When we look at the unilateral refuses to deal, as we previously looked at, any joint refusals to deal, which basically goes back to talking about the group boycotts, they are subject to close scrutiny under Section 1 of the Sherman Act. And a single manufacturer acting unilaterally normally is free to deal or not to deal with whomever it wishes. So, but nevertheless, when we think about it, there are some instances where a unilateral refusal to deal could violate Section 2 of the Sherman Act, and that's going to involve a firm refusing to deal or has likely going to acquire a monopoly power, and also the refusal is likely to have an anti-competitive effect on a particular market. Section 2 also prohibits attempted monopolization of a market. And to make that happen, there has to be proof of three different elements. There has to be, first, the anti-competitive conduct. Second, there has to be specific intent to exclude competitors and garner a monopoly power. And three, a dangerous probability of success in achieving the monopoly power has to exist. In 1914, Congress attempted to strengthen the federal antitrust laws by enacting the Clayton Act. The Clayton Act was aimed at very specific anti-competitive or monopolistic practices that the Sherman Act did not cover. The substantive provisions of the Act deal with four distinct forms of business behavior, which are declared illegal but not criminal. In each instance, the Act states that the behavior is illegal only if it tends to substantially lessen competition or create monopoly power within an area. And the major offenses of the Clayton Act are set out in sections 2, 3, 7, and 8 of the Clayton Act. So when we look at section 2 of the Clayton Act, it prohibits price discrimination, which occurs when a seller charges different prices to competing buyers for the identical goods or services. Congress strengthened this section by amending it in 1936 with the passage of the Robinson-Patman Act. As amended, Section 2 prohibits price discrimination that cannot be justified by differences in production cost, transportation cost, or cost differences due to other reasons. So when we look at Section 2, the requirements to violate Section 2, the seller must be engaged in interstate commerce and the goods must be part of like grade and quality, and the goods must have been sold in two or more purchasers in the sale of those items. So in addition, the effect of the price discrimination must be to substantially lessen competition, tend to create a monopoly, or otherwise injure competition. And without proof of an actual injury resulting from the price discrimination, the plaintiff cannot recover any damages when there are any lawsuits. Price discrimination claims can also arise from any discounts, offsets, rebates, or allowances that are given to any one buyer and not others, giving favorable credit terms, delivery terms, freight charges to some buyers and not all, can also lead to the potential allegation that there is price discrimination. For instance, in some circumstances, offering goods to different consumers or customers at the same price, but also including free delivery for some of the consumers or customers may violate Section 2. So if a distributor is selling everything at the same price, but at the same time they are charging certain companies the delivery fees to get it to them, but others they're not charging that same freight to get it to them, could wind up being a violation of Section 2. And when we look at Section 2, the only defenses that can be used deal with cost justification. In other words, there the seller can only justify a price reduction by demonstrating that a particular buyer's purchase um, saved the seller cost in producing and selling the goods, and then the seller will not be liable for price discrimination. And this could simply be something such that a distributor, somebody in the organization misread a lot of 1,000 and produced 10,000. So if that seller finds a company that's willing to buy the additional 9,000 above and beyond the 1,000 that they were contracted to create for a certain price, then they could sell the additional 9,000 at a reduced rate in order to move them because they basically made a mistake and they need to move the product. So that would be outside of justification or outside of someone being able to charge them with a violation of Section 2. Meeting a competitor's pricing. If the seller basically is charging a lower price in good faith to meet an equally low price of a competitor, then they're okay. They're not going to be charged with price discrimination. For example, if you have two different distributors and they both make white bread and wheat bread, and all of a sudden the second competitor runs a promotion and they're selling their bread loaf $1 off to everyone that buys it. The other company can do the same, and neither one would be in violation because they're meeting competitive pricing with the situation. And then the other is the changing market conditions. Um, a seller may lower its price on an item in response to the changing conditions of any marketplace or marketability of the goods that are concerned. A good example would be um, we have iPads, we have Galaxy tabs, we have the Lenovo tablets, and all these different things. And as each one um, comes out with the new ones, and oftentimes they're going to um, bring in their new item at a higher price, and then their older versions may reduce in price. But at the same time, if Galaxy comes out with a tablet and it's $300 lower than the iPad, most likely Apple is not going to reduce the price of their iPad. But if Lenovo comes out with a very similar tablet at $100 less than the Galaxy tablet, most likely Galaxy would drop their pricing on the tablet because Galaxy and Lenovo may be more competitive with each other than they would be with Apple and the iPad products. So, and of course, we do have state laws that um, are going to govern price discrimination. Um, in some states, you do have state minimum pricing. Alaska is one that has state minimum pricing on tobacco and cigarette products. And with that, there's a minimum that it can be sold at retail, but also above and beyond that minimum, you have to take and add the taxation that is added based on the muni or borough that you are in when you sell those products. For example, um, those of you that may smoke or know people that smoke may wonder why a pack of cigarettes in Anchorage may be $16, $17, $18 a pack, but if you drive up the Parks Highway and say stop in Healy or Fairbanks or something, it could be, $3 a pack less than what you would pay for it here in Anchorage. and that's because of the local muni taxes. Um, so that's where state pricing can come in, that there is a state minimum that you can charge for items, uh, but that is exclusive of any local and muni taxes that may be on each of the items that you're looking at. Under Section 3 of the Clayton Act, sellers or lessors cannot condition the sale or lease of goods on the buyer's or lessee's promise not to use or deal in goods of the seller's competitor. In effect, this section is going to prohibit two types of vertical agreements involving exclusionary practices, basically exclusive dealing contracts and tying arrangements. When we look at the exclusive dealings contract, this is a contract under which a seller forbids a buyer to purchase products from a seller's competitor, and this is known as the exclusive dealing contract. A seller is prohibited from making an exclusive deal contract under Section 3 if the effect of the contract is to substantially lessen competition or it will tend to create a monopoly. And the Supreme Court's decision in 1949, uh, there was a number of subsequent decisions that have been called um, the holding in the case of doubt. And today it's clear that to violate antitrust law, uh, where an exclusive dealing agreement exists, there must be a qualitative and a substantially harmful situation against the competitors. And in order to prevail, plaintiff must present an affirmative grouping of evidence that the performance of the agreement will foreclose competition and harm the consumer with those agreements that are in place. Now, looking at tying arrangements, when a seller conditions the sale of a product on the buyer's agreement to purchase another product um, that is produced or distributed by the same dealer, then you have a tying agreement in place. So, in other words, your seller is saying that if you buy this product, you must buy this other product that goes along with it. Now, the legality of tying arrangements depends on many factors, particularly the purpose of the agreement and its likely effect on competition when it comes to the relevant markets within which they are operating. Section 3 of the Clayton Act has been held to apply to uh, primarily commodities, rarely services, and some tying agreements, however, can be considered agreements that restrain trade in violation of Section 1 of the Sherman Act. So there could be multiple violations depending on how these tying agreements and arrangements are structured between the buyer and the seller. When we look at Section 7, this does involve mergers. And under Section 7 of the Clayton Act, A person or business organization cannot hold stock or assets in another entity where the effect may be substantially designed to lessen competition. Section 7 is the statutory authority for preventing mergers or acquisitions that could result in a monopoly power or a substantial lessening of competition within a marketplace. For example, we've probably all heard in the news in the past about how Kroger and Albertsons wanted to merge, but for that to happen, there was going to have to be a divestiture of um, stores in multiple marketplaces across the U.S. in order for that to happen. And in the end, the divestiture uh, plan that was submitted did not meet the court's acceptance, so therefore it was uh, by court order, Kroger and Albertsons could not merge. Now, you think about how that merger would have impacted Anchorage if if you whether you realize or not, all of our Fred Meyers here are franchises of the Kroger grocery store group, and all of our Safeway cars groups, they're actually now owned by Albertsons. And had Albertsons and Kroger merged, almost every grocery store in the state of Alaska, unless it was an independent location such as an IGA or others that in some of the smaller communities, would have all been under the same umbrella, under the Kroger Albertsons umbrella. So therefore, there would be no competition. And one of the things that was to have happened here in Alaska is that Albertsons had put that the Alaska market would be sold to a third party if the merger came into place. What I think is kind of pretty cool, and some people have laughed, is that the company that Albertsons was looking at selling the Safeway's cars locations in Alaska to is a company known as Piggly Wiggly. Now, if you are from the South or you have been in the South, you will see Piggly Wiggly grocery stores. Piggly Wiggly's been around longer than some other grocery stores uh, in the South, but I thought that was kind of interesting and potentially fun conversation pieces because I'm finding that the longer I live in Alaska, the more things come to Alaska that go back to a lot of my southern roots as far as being here. And had Piggly Wiggly shown up here in Alaska and the cars had been rebranded to Piggly Wigglies, then it would almost be like living at home in Savannah where I grew up in Georgia again. When we, and that basically covers the market concentration. Now, when we look at horizontal mergers, this could be mergers between firms that compete with each other in the same market. Horizontal mergers do create entities with significant market shares um, and could become illegal uh, if there is an increase in market concentration. And this is where the FTC and the, which is Federal Trade Commission, and the U.S. Department of Justice, the DOJ, are going to have guidelines to ensure that these type mergers don't um, happen. And again, this would be the grouping under which, had it happened, the Kroger and Albertsons merger would have fallen under this type of a horizontal merger, uh, and also have created a market concentration with that merger. Now, when we look at uh, the vertical merger, this generally occurs when a company at any one stage of its production acquires a company at a higher or lower stage of production. An example of a vertical merger is where a company merging with one of its suppliers or retailers occurs and eliminates one of the elements of the distribution chain. And in this type of a merger, it generally is going to produce a firm that would have a controlling interest and an undue proportion in a relevant market within the items that they are that they have access to. When it comes to enforcement and exemptions, the Department of Justice can prosecute violations of the Sherman Act, which may be either criminal or civil offenses. Violations of the Clayton Act are not crimes, but they can act such that they can be enforced by either the Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission through civil procedures. The DOJ or the FTC or the courts can impose various remedies, including the divestiture, which, as I mentioned, the Kroger-Albertsons merger would have required that in multiple markets across the U.S., they would have to divest of stores and sell to a third party. That way, there would not be a monopoly in those communities. The FTC has sole authority to enforce any violations of Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act, and there are times when the FTC can seek court sanctions where there are violations, if that's what it takes to enforce. When we look at 21.5b here, this part of the chapter, this involves actions by private parties. A private party who has been injured as a result of a violation of the Sherman Act or the Clayton Act can basically sue for treble damages. Treble damages basically means 3 times the actual damages that are suffered, plus they can recover any attorney's fees. And in some cases, they can also seek for an injunctive relief to prevent the antitrust violations. Now, under the Sherman Act, for an individual to sue, then they have to be capable of proving that the antitrust violation either caused or was a substantial factor in causing injury that has been suffered, and 2, that the unlawful action of the accused party affected the business activities of the plaintiff that were protected under antitrust laws. So additionally, the United States Supreme Court has held that to pursue antitrust laws, private parties must present some evidence suggesting that an illegal agreement was made. And exemptions from the antitrust laws do include many legislative and constitutional limitations when it comes to the enforcement of antitrust situations. Most are going to be statutory or judicial uh, created exemptions that are going to apply to areas involving labor, agricultural situations, fisheries, insurance, exporters, professional, baseball, oil marketing, um, defense activities, small business co-ops, any state action, any regulated industry, or any business person um, that has joint efforts to seek a government action. One of the most significant exemptions does cover joint efforts by business persons to obtain any legislature, judicial, or executive action. And under this exemption, for example, Blu-ray producers can jointly lobby Congress to change the copyright laws without being held liable for attempting to restrain trade. And most of us may or may not remember the Blu-ray phase that was around the same time as CDs were coming out and being a part of life. Um, when it comes to the U.S. antitrust laws as it relates to global content, the U.S. antitrust laws, they have a very broad application. Not only may persons in foreign nations be subject to these provisions, but the laws may also be applied to protect foreign consumers and competitors from violations committed by U.S. business firms. Consequently, foreign persons, um, which is a term that by definition will also include foreign governments, may sue under U.S. antitrust laws in U.S. courts if um, situations come up to where antitrust laws are being violated as written by the United States law. Extraterritorial application of U.S. antitrust laws. The United States is a major proponent of free competition within the global economy, and accordingly, Section 1 of the Sherman Act does provide for extraterritorial effort of the U.S. antitrust laws, and any conspiracy that has any substantial effect on U.S. commerce is within the reach of the Sherman Act. When it comes to the application of foreign antitrust laws, large U.S. Companies are increasingly concerned about the application of foreign antitrust laws, and as such, the European Union in particular has stepped up its enforcement of actions against any antitrust violations. The European Union laws promote competition, but are stricter in many respects than those of the United States, and they do define more conduct as anti-competitive. The European Union actively will pursue antitrust violators, especially individual companies and any cartel that allegedly engages in any monopolistic conduct. And when we look at increased enforcement in Asia and Latin America, um, these nations, along with others, have laws that will promote competition and also prohibit trade restrictions. Um, Japanese antitrust laws forbid unfair trade practice, monopoly, and any restriction that is unreasonable such that it can restrain trade. China's antitrust rules restrict monopolies and price fixing, um, with the exception that the Chinese government can set their prices on exported goods. Um, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, Vietnam, they have statutes protecting competition. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, and several other Latin American countries also have adopted modern antitrust laws as well. And most of the antitrust laws are going to apply extraterritorial, just like the U.S. antitrust laws do. So this means that a U.S. company may be subject to another nation's antitrust law if the company's conduct has a substantial effect on the nation's commerce. China, for instance, has stepped up its enforcement of laws against anti-competitive practices. It fined the U.S. chip maker Qualcomm $975 million for violating their antitrust laws in 2015. China's also targeted Microsoft with its antitrust investigations and has searched Microsoft companies' servers in China for any evidence of any violation. And in 2018, China announced that it was consolidating its three existing antitrust enforcement agencies under one, signaling an intent to become more aggressive in their pursuit of violators of any antitrust laws that are connected to China. And that concludes chapter 21's lecture for this evening. Chapter 22 will follow.